Elizabeth Gilbert, who you may know as the author of the worldwide phenomenon Eat, Pray, Love, published another memoir a couple months ago called All the Way to the River: Love, Loss, and Liberation. Despite what you may have heard about Elizabeth Gilbert, I want to clarify that we are not talking about some vapid chick-lit writer who creates Hallmark plots here. In the 90s, when she lived in New York, she was shortlisted for the National Book Award twice before even writing Eat, Pray, Love. Her early short stories, The Finest Wife and Elk Talk, are still frequently taught in MFA programs. You may be familiar with the movie from 2000, Coyote Ugly, Tyra Banks' third best movie after obviously Life Size 1 and Life Size 2, which was also an adaptation of an essay that Gilbert wrote for GQ about herself and the girls who worked at a gritty New York City dive bar, where she says she measured a successful night by how many marriage proposals she got. For the 90s and early 2000s, Elizabeth Gilbert was a promising, scrappy, and plucky indie author who everyone from the stuffy academics to the New York City underground artists pointed at and said, "That girl is gonna do something big." And then she did. In 2006, she wrote Eat, Pray, Love. A quick recap. Eat, Pray, Love is a memoir. It opens with Elizabeth Gilbert sobbing, crying on her bathroom floor because she feels stuck in her marriage and she wants out. So she gets what would be her first divorce. She has a devastating situationship, and then in the wake of that breakup, she has an epiphany. She needs to discover who she is without a man. So she sells everything, she swears off sex, and she goes on a 3-part journey. Italy to eat, India to pray, and Indonesia, where she falls in love with a Brazilian man who would become her second husband. This book went on to become the single most successful memoir of the decade. It was on the top of the New York Times bestseller list for years. It was turned into a blockbuster film starring the beloved actress Julia Roberts, and suddenly Gilbert had millions of fans and more money than she knew how to spend. After Eat, Pray, Love, Gilbert continued to put out high-quality writing. She became a respected speaker with multiple TED Talks. She wrote a book called Big Magic, which is like an advice book for creatives. She put out a lot of fiction, and along with being a famous writer, she also became sort of a spiritual guide, and she developed a following of people who saw her as almost this like saint-like figure. And then this year in September, Gilbert put out another memoir called All the Way to the River: Love, Loss, and Liberation, and fans were expecting a breezy, spiritual, colorful story written in Elizabeth Gilbert's signature style. Instead, when they started marketing this book, we readers were told a story that was as surprising as it was disturbing. According to these marketing materials and early snippets, it sounded like Gilbert fell in love with her hairdresser, a woman named Rayya, who was a former addict, and then when Rayya got a terminal cancer diagnosis, Gilbert left her husband to party with Rayya as her lover for her final days. But then, when Rayya's addiction got really bad again, Gilbert decided that she would murder Rayya. Rayya caught on to Gilbert's plan, so Gilbert didn't go through with it, and then Gilbert decided that the whole experience was too degrading to her soul, so she broke up with Rayya. When we get into the full synopsis of the book in a minute, you can see for yourself how accurate or inaccurate that version of events was. Because of the way that this book was marketed and the story that was told through the marketing, I thought that I would dislike this book because of Gilbert's poor decisions or even cruelty in it, but that was not the case. I still didn't like the book, but not because of Gilbert's bad decisions, although they did make it a tough read sometimes. I didn't like the book because I didn't think that it was well written. And what I kept asking myself, and what I would like to explore in this review, is what happened? How did somebody who was a widely acclaimed, good writer put out something that was so different and I felt so much worse than the things that she used to write? Now, my first review of this book was pretty much a roast. Then I met with my book club. You can join my book club via my Patreon. It's $3 a month. I'll put a link in the description. This month we're reading Trust by Hernan Diaz. And while many people in my book club meeting also didn't like the book, there were people who felt like they got a lot out of it. So I will still roast the book, but my roast will be punctuated by observations from people in my book club who liked the book, making it a light roast. A medium rare, if you will. Oh my gosh, do you hear that barefaced ibis? Sometimes I'll get really excited about a topic, and there's always that voice in my head like, well, you're not going to make any money from bird watching. Or, oh, well, I'm already so busy. I remember that a curious and a passionate life is a life well lived. And then I get like obsessed with drawing birds for like 3 months. So I really do love partnering with Skillshare to talk about them on this channel, because it's a platform with classes about a wide array of topics that can be used for professional growth or even just for the creative hobbyist. And Skillshare isn't just for you to use personally. This holiday season, it can make a great gift for that person who you love, who has that, creative hunger. Skillshare has classes taught by world-class creatives, like professional illustrators, renowned graphic designers, and successful entrepreneurs. The platform is designed to help you build creativity into your life by learning directly from real, talented, and successful creatives. So for example, I love language learning, and so I've been taking some French classes on Skillshare, and it is unbelievably helpful. She goes through every single vowel, which is something that I was really having trouble with, and I already feel like I've been learning a lot. So I'm excited to share that the first 500 people to use the link in my description or scan the QR code will receive a 1-month free trial of Skillshare. Plus, like I said, you can gift Skillshare memberships to friends or family. So get started today, and thank you so much to Skillshare. A ver, ¿qué quiere? Hola, mi vida. Okay, so I'm going to summarize the book so that we're all on the same page, and then I'll get into my review. The book is written in short chapters about Gilbert's relationship with Rayya, interspersed with poems and doodles. Most of the poems are written from the perspective of God talking to Elizabeth Gilbert like a baby. No, literally, calling her kiddo and telling her that she hasn't done anything wrong, and if she ever did do anything wrong, it was not her fault, it was because she was an addict. Elizabeth Egan with the New York Times reviewed this book and compared reading these poems to getting stuck in the face with pins. And I have to say I agree. These poems are probably the worst part of the book for me. Gilbert also includes a lot of doodles. I am intentionally calling them doodles, not sketches or even drawings, because they look like something you would draw during geometry class. Some people like that. It gives the book kind of like a raw feel. I found it kind of distracting. Gilbert explains that since Rayya passed, Gilbert has gotten sober from drugs, alcohol, and sex and love. Something that is very noticeable in Gilbert's prose is that it's become much more clipped than in her previous books. She's using the enter key a lot. She's also using italics in casual slang terms, or even references to internet memes pretty often. As a result, the prose feels choppy and informal, almost as if it were a speech or a social media post. Listen to how Gilbert describes this visit from Rayya. And this is not a poem, this is one of the prose chapters. Where had she gone? Italics, new line. Had she moved on, or had I left her behind? New line. I could make no sense of it. New line. It was as if she'd stepped out of the universe for a pack of cigarettes and had never come back. New line. But now, on the morning of my 54th birthday, suddenly she was here. New line. I mean, really here, in italics. New line. The room was humming with big Rayya energy, and I felt chills up my entire body. And then Rayya gives Gilbert a big speech where she tells her that she's proud of her, to stop worrying about other people too much, and she says, quote, "You're on the right track. You found your God, and your God is fucking awesome. Your God is lit." Close quote. Rayya also tells Gilbert, quote, "Between us and about us, shit got super fucked up at the end, and that wasn't your fault or my fault. It wasn't even wrong how things went. It just had to be." Close quote. And then Rayya leaves Gilbert with this message, quote, "As for the book, just write the living shit out of that thing. Tell the people exactly what happened. Tell them every single thing that happened. Don't worry about protecting my dignity or yours. Just go full punk rock with it. Lay it all out there. What use do I have for dignity now? You don't need dignity either, so fuck it. It's time for you to write a completely honest book about addiction, yours and mine. It'll help some people, so don't hold back." Close quote. Rayya then adds, quote, "You're going all the fucking way this time, all the way to enlightenment." Close quote. I again want to emphasize that Rayya did not say or write any of this during her lifetime. This is all Gilbert telling us what Rayya communicated to her telepathically and posthumously in a vision. We had a long conversation in my book club about whether or not this book was exploitative to Rayya, and in that debate, this first chapter, this spirited endorsement of the book through Rayya's mouth, came up a lot. And I'll go into more detail about that when I'm reviewing the book. In the next chapter, Gilbert gets into describing Rayya in depth. Rayya was born in Syria. She was a child in Aleppo and then raised in Detroit. Then as a young adult, she moved to the Lower East Side in New York City. Gilbert says Rayya never felt fully at home anywhere, and her parents were hardworking and had been affluent in Syria, and they simply could not make sense of Rayya. She was wild and disobedient from a young age and was already sneaking out and selling acid by the time she was 13. Rayya had grown up in a religious, Orthodox community, so she actually didn't come out until she was in her early 20s, but she always presented as quite androgynous. Gilbert writes about Rayya's dark eyes and dramatic cheekbones and says, quote, "Her face changed from male to female, from wise to playful, from timeless to childish as the light shifted," close quote. And you'll notice that that keeps happening. There are these moments when Gilbert's old style of prose peeks through the choppy conversational style, and you get this glimmer of nostalgia as you remember that she was this fantastic writer. Gilbert characterizes Rayya as a talented creative, a musician, a writer, a filmmaker, and hairdresser, but she also struggled with insecurity and shame and creative paralysis, and she passed away without ever having become as successful as she wanted to be. She says Rayya had been in and out of jail, in and out of rehab, and was homeless for long spans of time. Rayya did get clean, but then, after a decade of going to Alcoholics Anonymous and Narcotics Anonymous, she said she didn't want to label herself as an addict anymore, so she graduated herself from recovery. You'll see later on how that panned out for her. Gilbert also describes a very, very strong community of chosen family that Rayya surrounded herself with. She was still close with all of her exes. Gilbert says Rayya had everyone's keys and everyone's passwords, and once dropped everything and flew halfway across the country to physically remove a friend from an abusive household. Gilbert says everyone wanted to be with Rayya, but Elizabeth Gilbert was the one whom Rayya loved the most. Gilbert explains that the title of the book, All the Way to the River, is a metaphor that Rayya used to make about having your closest friend, the friend who would walk all the way across New York City to the East River with you. As Rayya is dying, this metaphor of taking her all the way to the river becomes representative of Gilbert being with Rayya up until her death, accompanying her to the other side, even through all of the gritty and scary parts of the walk to the East River. Gilbert goes on to describe how she met Rayya. It was the year 2000. Gilbert was 31 and married to her first husband, and she felt like she was following a role in life. The good girl, and then the good wife, and then someday the good mother, but she was about to fall completely in love with someone outside of her marriage, namely James Franco. Not really, but that's who played him in the movie. She was, at this time, a highly paid freelance writer who was celebrated as an up-and-coming author. She had already written Pilgrims and The Muse of the Coyote Ugly Saloon. The Coyote Ugly movie would be released that year. Gilbert actually met her first husband while working at the Coyote Ugly Saloon in real life. Fun fact. So things were going well, but she seems to perceive herself at this time as sort of square and boring. A friend recommended Rayya as a hairdresser, but she told Liz Gilbert that Rayya will only cut your hair if she likes you. Rayya figured out how to deal with Gilbert's hair. Gilbert describes her own hair as duck fluff 4 times in this book, as pointed out in the New York Times review. Gilbert describes Rayya as, quote, "funny and interesting and exotic," close quote, which didn't sit right with me. And she says that she liked her very much, but she didn't fall in love with her on that first day. Rayya also told Gilbert on that first day that she had been addicted to and coke for most of her adult life, but she got clean in 1997. Rayya described her life at that time, saying that she used to cut hair for 4 days and then she would ride her motorcycle to the beach for another 3 days. And when people encouraged her to work more days and expand her business, she told them to fuck off. And Gilbert saw this as such a contrast to her own life at that time, when she felt like she was living for everybody else all the time. But Rayya was impressed with Gilbert because Gilbert made a living as a creative, and Rayya had a really tormented relationship with her own creativity. For example, she was having trouble performing the music that she had written now that she was sober. Because sober, she had paralyzing stage fright, and she was only ever able to perform previously because of her addictions. In the next chapter, Gilbert talks a lot about sex and love addiction, and especially the process of being a sex and love addict as a woman. So she goes on to share that she and her first husband split up so that she could be with James Franco, and then her and James Franco had a terrible breakup, and that left her like completely floored, so she decided to sell everything and travel the world at the behest of the voice of God, which she hears in her mind. Gilbert writes, quote, "After my divorce and my breakup, I quit my job, sold everything, and followed the God voice around the world. At the end of my travels, I met a charismatic Brazilian man who poured love, attention, validation, and approval upon me with lavish abundance. I gave myself over to him without restraint. He gave himself over to me too. We moved back to America and we got married. I wrote a book about my travels. That book became Eat, Pray, Love. Suddenly, I had a shit ton of money." Close quote. She says that she felt guilty about having that much money, and she also wanted to buy love with it. So she started giving it away in enormous chunks, buying her friends' houses and paying for their weddings and sending their kids to nice schools and donating to causes and politicians and paying off her friends' debt. But she says that this spending did not end well. People ended up resenting her, arguing with her. She lost many friendships and even got in legal trouble because of all this spending. Gilbert says that about half the people whom she gave money to at this time in her life would now cross the street if they saw her coming. She says that around this time, Rayya was still cutting hair and was mostly doing well. She was in a domestic partnership with a woman named Gigi, attending her 12-step programs, trying to be stable, and she had gotten into real estate. But then she and Gigi realized that they wanted different things and they split up. Then 2008 came and the real estate market, which Rayya had been using to make money, completely crashed. Rayya had hepatitis C from her years of drug use and her hep C started flaring up and causing issues. Rayya was forced to sell the apartments that she had and move into a studio in Chelsea with no light. A few years prior, Gilbert had bought a church sight unseen from an internet cafe in Laos because she saw a photo and believed that it must be her forever home. So Gilbert and her husband decide that they don't like living and working in the old church, so they moved out, but Gilbert kept it, planning to make it a spiritual retreat or a space for creative workshops. But then instead of doing that, she gave the house to Rayya so that she didn't have to live in Chelsea. She says that Rayya stood in the middle of the church and wept. She could not stop crying, and she just kept saying, "Nobody's ever given me anything like this." Gilbert then describes a little bit of her own past of giving herself and her things and her privacy away too quickly and to people she hardly knew because she wanted their love in exchange. She wanted to be a hero and she wanted to be adored, and she put herself into dangerous and compromising scenarios to achieve that affection, often to disastrous ends. Gilbert goes on to say that the initial agreement was that Rayya would live in the church for 3 months. Rayya ended up living there for free for 9 years until she passed away. Over the coming years, Gilbert led a highly successful public life. She gave TED Talks and built a large social media following. She published more books. She says that her relationship with her second husband was good at the time, but she also says that she will not, out of respect for him, go into detail about their marriage or its end. Although she does say, quote, "We were always good to each other. We loved each other, and we are still kind to each other." Close quote. But she says that secretly she was constantly anxious and panicked and afraid. She says that she always felt there was something fundamentally broken or wrong with her, like she was never safe, but she didn't want to share those thoughts because she felt that it would make her sound ungrateful for her highly blessed life. Through the beginning of this book, she has hinted at this anxious and urgent need to be loved as coming from a specific childhood trauma, but she says that she will not discuss this childhood trauma because there were people involved who are still alive. But it does sound like it led to her feeling very unsafe as a child and to developing very unhealthy relationship habits as an adult. Around this time of financial prosperity from Eat, Pray, Love, she says that she drank every day, took sleeping pills every night, and was constantly on and off anti-anxiety and antidepressant medications. She no longer did yoga or meditated or did any of the other spiritual practices that she had picked up on her trip to India and raved about in Eat, Pray, Love. She fell out of those habits not long after her trip. Once Rayya moved into Gilbert's church, the two women started to see each other practically every day, and Gilbert witnessed Rayya's social abilities. She says that Rayya was always herself, always candid. If everyone was trying to sound intellectual, then Rayya would say, "Nobody knows what the fuck you guys are talking about." She typically greeted Gilbert's 6-year-old godson by saying, "Hey, you little fuck." If someone was arrogant and entitled, she would say to their face, "Wow, man, I never knew what a little bitch you could be." Rayya constantly talked about how much she loved the truth, especially as a former addict who spent years lying and manipulating. Remember that later. Gilbert says that she had gotten accustomed to constant low-grade terror, but when Rayya was around, that terror went away. And Gilbert says that she did fall in love with Rayya pretty quickly after she moved her into the church. She was still married to someone else, but she says that Rayya was the first person she called in an emergency, her first invite to every social event, and her primary confidant. She asked Rayya for advice on nearly everything and followed her advice often blindly, to the point where she found herself wondering how she ever survived before she met this woman. She was secretly in love with Rayya, but instead of having that difficult conversation with her husband, she started to find ways to keep Rayya close to her. So after the first summer of Rayya living in the church, Gilbert told her to stay for free and told her that she could call it a writing retreat. So she encouraged her to write a memoir full-time while Gilbert covered her expenses. She said, quote, "Give me the complete manuscript in 9 months and that will be your rent." Close quote. Rayya was fresh out of a major breakup. Her finances were still not solid at this point. She was almost 50 and her body was battered from years of drug addiction, living on the street and also dealing with symptoms from hepatitis C. She was having trouble being on her feet all day so that she could cut hair, and for most of her life, she already felt like she had failed as an artist. Now, Gilbert is giving her the chance to write all day for free, and also giving her access to a glamorous community of artists and celebrities and possibly even a chance to become famous and successful herself as an author. But Gilbert was also moving her away from Manhattan, where she had lived for decades, and thus taking away a lot of her community support, most notably her support from Alcoholics Anonymous and Narcotics Anonymous. She was also making Rayya quite dependent on her, becoming her boss, her landlord, and pretty much her only physically present and available friend, as far as I could tell. And while Gilbert does admit that she was exerting control over Rayya at this point and seems to understand that that was wrong and a direct result of her sex and love addiction, she also writes, quote, "Rayya was never anybody's victim and I'm not powerful enough to control anybody's destiny." Close quote. And that reminded me of a quote from Beautiful World, Where Are You by Sally Rooney. Quote, "You underestimate your power, so you don't have to reckon with how poorly you treat people." Close quote. I'll talk a bit more in my review portion about this tendency that Gilbert has in the language to infantilize herself and underestimate her own power and thus her own ability to victimize others. Because while she's saying, "I'm not powerful enough to control anybody's destiny," she is also in a position of serious professional and financial power over Rayya. She's right that Rayya could have said no, but I still think it's disingenuous to ignore that hierarchy and power imbalance in their relationship. Then we get this poem from the perspective of God, in which God calls Elizabeth Gilbert at different points "Angel, my little one, clever girl, my darling, and my beloved child." Gilbert reveals toward the end of this book that these chapters were her way of doing inner child work, as in speaking to herself, but as a child. And while I understand the therapeutic intention here, it is quite jarring as the reader to read prose about this super powerful, filthy, rich, middle-aged woman, and then immediately read poetry in which that same woman talks to herself like a child. This discomfort becomes especially acute when Gilbert is making bad decisions in life, or decisions that really hurt other people, and you turn the page and God is telling her that she is very small and she hasn't done anything wrong.
You're not a baby, you're a man! No, I'm a baby.
In the next chapter, Gilbert writes that she really did love Rayya, but she also is a love addict. So she fell in love with her in a way that was genuine, but also manipulative, fearful, and stemming from a place of her own need for love and attention. But Gilbert says she wasn't the only one who was lying and manipulating. In fact, while Rayya was writing a memoir about her miraculous recovery from substance addiction, she was also drinking every day. After 9 months of writing, Rayya hadn't finished her memoir, so Gilbert asked her to pay, not rent, but the church's utility bill. This was around 2008. The Eat, Pray, Love movie came out in 2010, so 2 years later, when Gilbert was flying around the world for premieres and red carpets, she invited Rayya as her +1 so that Rayya could do her hair and makeup. The women met Oprah together and traveled the world together and got Botox together and went to family holidays together. Gilbert said that Rayya made jewelry Julia Roberts laugh hysterically when she said to her mid-hug, "Dude, you smell so fucking good right now." I had to include that. It just really tracks for me that Julia Roberts smells amazing. Liz Gilbert said that she was able to have this type of relationship with Rayya because her husband didn't like these social events. But really, she writes, quote, "I was steadily moving my love and loyalty away from one person and toward another," close quote. She says that Rayya continued dating other women at this time, but she would come home and say, quote, "She was nice enough, but she's not Liz. Can't we just clone you instead so I can have another one of you? Wouldn't that be better for everyone?" Close quote. Liz would also get jealous of Rayya's partners and demand more time and more attention from Rayya. Rayya's friends started to get irritated with this arrangement, and people who she had known for her entire life started to feel second-rate and ignored. So Rayya at this time, despite being publicly sober, she would carry around these little Angostura bitters, and she would down them as like digestives. These bitters contain spices and herbs and a high alcohol content. Rayya told Gilbert that a doctor had prescribed these bottles of alcohol to her to help with stomach pain. Remember, Rayya had hepatitis C, and it is extremely dangerous and often fatal to drink alcohol if you have hepatitis C. Gilbert never pushed this or even admitted to herself during this time that Rayya was still drinking. She continued to pay Rayya to write a memoir about her sobriety. In 2013, Rayya published her memoir, Harley Loco, and Gilbert published the novel, The Signature of All Things. Gilbert describes these books as deeply artistically relevant to both of the women. For Rayya, Harley Loco was evidence that she could finish a project and she was a legitimate and respectable artist. For Gilbert, The Signature of All Things was what she saw as her proof to critics that she was an important literary figure and not just a writer of popular chick lit. The books were both commercially and critically successful, especially Gilbert's The Signature of All Things, and so the two women went on a book tour together. Publications started to write about this unlikely pair, basically like a couple. The Sydney Morning Herald wrote, quote, "Everything about their pact seems to rail against natural order, yet here they are, 14 years into what has become a very deep friendship, clasping hands, finishing each other's sentences, Elias absent-mindedly fixing Gilbert's hair," close quote. Rayya said in that same article titled Opposites Attract, quote, "I know it sounds like a love story, and it totally is," close quote. Gilbert replied, "Well, I'd rather go to the laundromat with you than to like Prague with anyone else," close quote. Not anyone else? Not even your husband of 10 years? Wait, guys, they're reminding me of Ariana Grande and Cynthia Erivo doing the Wicked press tour. At one book signing, a woman in line said, quote, "You two are such a terrific couple. You should get married," close quote. Rayya replied, "Believe me, I know. If Liz weren't straight, she'd totally be my wife." Liz Gilbert replied, "The reason we're not together isn't because I'm straight, for God's sake. It's because I'm married and I'm trying to be good," close quote. Gilbert says that later that night in her hotel room, she wept with longing for Rayya and fear for what was happening to her life. Then there's another poem where God calls Gilbert child and tells her to stop trying so hard to be good and to just give all of her pain over to God. The next chapter is called Rigid Bitches. Rayya invites Gilbert out to dinner in 2013, and she tells her that she needed to share something privately with her and she was afraid that she would be judged. She had recently gotten back from Detroit, where she was from, and she made up this whole story telling Gilbert that her friends and family in Detroit had a reverse intervention. And at this completely made up reverse intervention, they told her that they wanted her to start drinking wine again because she was healed of her addiction. And it's not fair that she still had to bear this label of addict. Gilbert thinks that this sounds great, and so she orders her some wine on the spot. Rayya cries with gratitude for Liz and criticizes all of her other friends from her 12-step programs and calls them cult members and rigid bitches, and she asks Gilbert to not tell their other friends that she's drinking wine again. When Rayya told Gilbert that the doctor had prescribed her alcohol, Gilbert had written, quote, Now, I don't know what the doctor said because I wasn't there, close quote. Now, she claims that she also doesn't know whether or not this reverse intervention happened, and I truthfully cannot tell if she was joking, but I certainly hope so. Over the coming years, Gilbert would watch as Rayya started drinking more and more. Gilbert would get in the car when Rayya drove drunk. On one occasion, she dragged Rayya's unconscious body down the street through the hotel lobby and back to their hotel room when Rayya got belligerent and passed out on a curb. The morning after Rayya passed out, Gilbert paid for a company that showed up at the hotel with an IV as a hangover cure. And then Rayya's friends found out that she was drinking again. Not Elizabeth Gilbert, Rayya's lifelong friends from her recovery program. Gilbert writes, quote, "Some of them cried, some of them raged, some of them argued with her, some of them cut her out of their lives completely, saying they couldn't be around this kind of behavior because it jeopardized their own sobriety," close quote. She writes that one of Rayya's friends said to her what somebody should have said to her a long time ago, quote, "Why are you even opening the door of using anything again? Setting aside the fact that you're an addict, you have hepatitis C. You're honestly going to go out there and drink on a hepatitis liver? This is going to kill you," close quote. Rayya pushes away all of her sober friends, or they leave her. She becomes more reliant on Elizabeth Gilbert. Journal entries from this time reveal that Rayya was drinking long before Gilbert saw the bitters, and she was getting wine drunk years before she made up that bullshit story about the reverse intervention. Gilbert then writes a poem that ends with the lines, quote, "Stop blocking the one miraculous gift we have given you for immediate release. It's called surrender. You're holding it in your hand right now, but you're also crushing it to death. Girl, you better open it up. Bitch, you better turn it loose," close quote. This woman is writing poetry like RuPaul. Then there's a whole chapter about addiction and some info about the history of AA, and then there's a doodle and a poem called How to Surrender. It's just 2 lines, quote, "For once in your life, let the butter cut the knife." Okay, so April 25th, 2016, Liz gets a phone call from Rayya. She says, quote, "Are you sitting down? They found tumors. Lots of them. Not just in my liver, in my pancreas too," close quote. After that phone call, Gilbert started crying and she couldn't stop. She had a vision in which Rayya died without Gilbert ever having told her how she really felt. She also seemed upset about the fact that other people would not know how important she and Rayya were to each other. She hated the idea of people saying, "I'm sorry about your friend," or the idea of not being okay ever again and no one would know why. She realizes as she's having this vision that she needs to tell her husband the truth. So she tells him about her feelings for Rayya and she tells him that they need to divorce. The following chapter is called 1,000 White Doves, and it's short. I'll read you the whole thing. "On the day that I finally told the truth to Rayya, that I loved her and that I had loved her for many years and that I wanted to be with her until she died, we had never so much as kissed. But again, it was a simple conversation. After I confessed my love to her, I asked, 'Do you like me that way? Do you like me that way?'" She then has in italics. What a thing to say. I might as well have passed her a note after gym class reading checkbox yes or no. In the space between my question and her answer, I held my breath, saturated with both hope and fear. I watched as Rayya put her hand on her chest and shut her eyes. After a long silence, she opened her eyes and smiled. She said, "I feel like a cage just opened in my heart and 1,000 white doves flew out." Then she gathered me up in her arms and said, baby, my beautiful baby, why did you take so long to come to me?" So again, this book has a lot of drawings in it. Gilbert is not an artist. The drawings seem like something you might expect to see in a therapy journal as opposed to a published work. But the issue with these drawings is that there are these very serious, heartfelt moments in the writing, like when Liz and Rayya are finally together after years of learning, and Rayya has this gorgeous quote, "Why did you take so long to come to me?" And then you turn the page and you get this bird. It's like a record scratch, like, "My baby, my beautiful baby, why did you take so long to come to me?" And then LeBron's drawing a Bart Simpson. You also really get the feeling, or I did, that something was missing here. Gilbert considered deeply what it would be like if she didn't pursue a romantic relationship with Rayya in this moment. But there was no consideration, at least written out in the book, of what was actually about to happen. More specifically, there was no serious pause to think of what it was going to be like to be a caretaker to a person with terminal cancer. She is about to get a difficult reality check, but I wanted to point out that I'm not skipping over her consideration of what was about to come. It actually just wasn't in the book. Maybe it happened in real life, but we didn't hear about it. We did then get a full chapter of Gilbert describing what it was like to finally have sex with Rayya. I thought it was lovely, honestly. She talks about how she knew Rayya's body and preferences and thoughts so intimately, but now finally being with her in this entirely new way felt infinite and transformative. At this point, it was April, and the doctors told Rayya that she would make it to Christmas. Rayya outright rejects any treatment. She says, quote, "No chemo, no radiation, no surgery, no hospitals, no life-extending measures. I don't mind dying of cancer, but I refuse to be a cancer patient for the rest of my life," close quote. Gilbert then writes that Rayya says she actually liked the idea of dying suddenly, but I also have to remind the reader that both Gilbert and Rayya are unreliable narrators. But at this time, Rayya seems to Gilbert exuberant and even ecstatic. She no longer has to worry about gaining weight or quitting cigarettes or working or going to the gym. She felt free of planning for the future, which was something she didn't really like to do anyway. She says that she was just disappointed that she was going to miss the end of Game of Thrones. And I read that, I was like, girl, be glad you missed the end of Game of Thrones. So the two women decide to live out every fantasy they had until Christmas. Rayya says, "Let's live balls to the wall until I die." Gilbert rents out music studios in Detroit and New York so Rayya can record her music. She books out a theater in New York so Rayya can put on a one-woman show. A British filmmaker decides to make a documentary about Rayya. They went out to bars and restaurants and they spent every last dime. Gilbert says that during this time she felt electric, in italics. She writes, quote, "My entire body and imagination were thrumming with the prospect of living without any limits or rules whatsoever, of doing whatever the hell we wanted, of throwing off the shackles of respectability and responsibility, of burning up the last few months of Rayya's life as her literal ride-or-die lover. Somehow we would be rescued, transformed, and immortalized by the sheer blasting heat, joy, and liberation of this once-in-a-million years love story. Christ, it felt amazing. Of course, I should also probably mention that we were high as hell at the time." Close quote. Gilbert then goes on to admit that they were drinking a lot, smoking a lot of medical-grade marijuana, using Xanax and Ambien, and taking mushrooms and MDMA. They were also experimenting sexually and trying out expressions of eroticism that she says got more and more extreme. While Rayya was the one who actually didn't have a future, Gilbert also started acting as if she had no future. She stopped working on a novel that she had been writing for 2 years. She canceled all public appearances. She canceled her podcast that she produced. She stopped calling her friends and family, started the divorce proceedings, stopped exercising, started eating almost exclusively junk, and stopped going outdoors for weeks at a time. Financially, she completely took over Rayya's life, paying for her treatment, her meals, her rent, her trips, and a series of elaborate gifts. She got her a Range Rover, a piano, a Rolex, Prada boots, and a penthouse apartment on her favorite street in East Village. She says, quote, "We stopped making love only to make music, food, and art," close quote. But in the next chapter, she asks, how high can you fly before you crash? She then points out that she was dismayed to remember that there were many other people in Rayya's life beside herself who loved her and who were having their own reactions to the diagnosis. These loved ones pushed Rayya to get chemo, and eventually she caved and agreed to get treatment to extend her life. Rayya said that she was just getting the treatment to make her friends and family happy, but the check was also arriving in some other ways. She was starting to experience pain from the cancer, sharp abdominal pain whenever she moved, and it sounds like that really spooked her. So she starts getting chemo, and the size of the tumors shrank along with the abdominal pain, but chemo comes with many other side effects, as you may know. She was constantly nauseated and vomiting. She was constantly itchy and couldn't sleep, so she was constantly exhausted, and the steroids made her gain weight. She could no longer do the things that she was doing before, like make love or sing or even walk, so she became depressed and anxious. She would often wake Liz up in the middle of the night to scream, quote, "Am I making all of this up? Am I really sick, or am I just trying to make people feel sorry for me because I'm a fat, lying, manipulative, lazy asshole?" Close quote. Gilbert cleaned Rayya, sat with her in the bathroom as she vomited, and brought her Gatorade, toast, cigarettes, and beer. Gilbert says that the process was brutal, but also felt, quote, like a sacred encounter with unconditional love, close quote. At night, Rayya would scream out, telling Gilbert to never leave her. But during the day, when she had more strength and felt more like herself again, she would encourage Liz to take some time away or to find help with caretaking. She told Liz that she was worried she would break down. But Liz refused to get help. She wrote, quote, "I took great pride during those first few months of Rayya's disease in how good I was at being her caregiver," close quote. She wrote, quote, "I had become the very essence of tireless service in the name of love, which was, to be honest, all I had ever wanted to be. I truly felt like an angel," close quote. She says that if the story had ended there, it would have been the most perfect love story ever told. I disagree, but let's continue. Gilbert writes that she stopped writing the book at this point for a few months, and she considered writing a different book, one in which Rayya never became an angry and cruel person. She says she wishes that Rayya had remained the way that Gilbert saw her before, quote, "heroic, brave, honest, astonishing, and cool," close quote. This part of the book confused me because Rayya was never honest with Gilbert before. She lied to her constantly, and many of the things that Gilbert perceived as cool, like the drugs and her candid nature, were actually tied to immense pain and vulnerability for Rayya. I just always saw Rayya as a traumatized person who used her raw personality and drugs as a front for deep sadness and fear of rejection, but I guess that was never transparent for Gilbert until these moments. Gilbert certainly had Rayya on a pedestal. She idealized her, and there is a dehumanizing element in idealizing someone. Gilbert shares an email that she wrote with a friend around this time before things really went south, in which she called Rayya, quote, "my most beautiful story," close quote. She reflects on this email now, saying, quote, "Now, I'm not sure whether it was even emotionally loving of me to reduce an entire human being down to nothing but a story that I was living in, beautiful or otherwise," close quote. I agree with her here. She seems more self-aware now in hindsight than perhaps she was in the moment. Rayya started accusing Gilbert of wanting her to die. She lamented that she was weak, that her life had been a failure. They hardly ever slept, and Gilbert begged Rayya to let her hire nurses who could at least help her through the night so that Gilbert could sleep. They tried hiring nurses, but Rayya would be aggressive to them and tell them that she didn't want them, she wanted Liz. Even if friends came to help her through the night, she would storm past them and wake up Liz and tell her, crying and furious, "I don't want them, I want you." It was the doctors who first prescribed Rayya opioids just to help her sleep through the night. At first, the morphine helped immensely. Rayya became loving and kind with Gilbert again. The women were able to sleep. But it didn't take long for Rayya to build up a resistance and start requiring handfuls of morphine pills every hour, to the point where she started screaming at doctors on the phone that she needed something stronger. So they gave her methadone, and then they gave her fentanyl. But Rayya said that it wasn't enough, so she started adding coke to the mix, first snorting it and then injecting it. Gilbert paid for Rayya's coke and picked it up for her. She even registered with the city of New York as an intravenous drug user so that she could get needles for Rayya. She tied off Rayya's arms and legs and held a light for her so that she could inject herself with drugs. Gilbert and Rayya began fighting every day. Brutal, screaming, crying fights. Then the owner of the penthouse that Rayya and Liz were living in wrote to them and told them that they needed to leave, and then hackers broke into Liz Gilbert's account and stole all her money. She ended up getting it back, but she had to get the FBI involved, and this was when Gilbert decided that she would kill Rayya. She writes, quote, "I am not talking here about a mercy killing or euthanasia or the arguably courageous act of helping someone who is in great suffering to have a death with dignity. Rayya, at that point, most certainly did not want to die, and she no longer gave a shit about dignity, close quote. Rayya was hallucinating all the time, seeing hot, itchy bugs under her skin, convincing herself that the cops were spying on them, feeling a demon living in her brain who stole her Rolex, and verbally abusing Gilbert every day. Every time Gilbert fell asleep, Rayya shook her awake. Gilbert says Rayya was losing to addiction and also losing all of the good qualities that she had gained from the years that she worked on being sober. Then Gilbert writes, quote, "And who was going to stop her? Me, the world's most spineless enabler, the Olympic codependency champion of 2017, Little Miss Duck Fluff, a blondie from Connecticut with puppy dog eyes and a desperate eagerness to be loved and validated and to make everyone happy," close quote. Now, I do think she's mocking herself here, but the self-infantilizing, even in hindsight, is quite grating. Elizabeth Gilbert is a remarkably, uniquely powerful person. She has more money than most people will ever see. She is a world-renowned celebrity, and now she's writing, "I can't stop her from using drugs. I'm blonde, and I'm from Connecticut." She is, at time of writing, 54 years old. That said, when we had our book club meeting, I thought that some people on the call made excellent points. First, somebody said basically, why did the doctors let this happen? Why did they give Rayya those drugs she used to be addicted to and at the same time prepare neither her nor her caregiver for a relapse? And there is actually a doctor in my book club who is on the call, and he has some clinical experience. And he essentially responded by saying, what exactly are we supposed to do? Because scenarios like Rayya's are not uncommon. Many people living with addiction put their bodies through extremely unhealthy, punishing circumstances that later in life give them deadly diseases. And there isn't really scientific consensus on the best way to handle circumstances like that. And the argument that this doctor in my book club made was that given that there is such a dearth of literature about people in this exact situation, the fact that Gilbert is even talking about this is useful and important. One writer on the call who has followed Elizabeth Gilbert and her writing for years just kept repeating, remember, she didn't have to write this book. She didn't have to tell us all of this. And regardless of my writing critiques, I do have to give Gilbert her flowers for that. Okay, so Gilbert decides to switch out Rayya's morphine pills with sleeping pills and cover her in patches. She went out to a park to examine the pills so that she could switch them and came back to the apartment excited and proud for having come up with this plan, and Rayya stares her down and says, quote, "Don't you start plotting against me now, Liz. Think carefully about what you're about to do." Close quote. Gilbert says that Rayya had fantastic intuition and she feels that Rayya could sniff her out. Rayya's response was like a shock for Gilbert, who realized that she had hit rock bottom and she needed to call someone and ask for help. So she goes back to the park and she starts calling people and opening up about what is really going on with Rayya behind the scenes. These friends all give her advice, and one friend tells Gilbert that she thinks she might have a sex and love addiction. You know that friend was waiting for that phone call. She had that advice ready immediately. Rayya and I can't stop fighting. You're addicted to sex. Go get yourself some help. The next chapter is called 0 out of 10 stars. It may have been the worst chapter in the book, in my opinion, aside from the poems and the drawings, if you count those. Gilbert, I think, tried to make this part funny, but she ends up sounding kind of like that Key and Peele skit where Jordan Peele keeps going, okay.
Okay.
Gilbert tries to stage an intervention for Rayya. She did it with no addiction expert, last minute, no script, no plan, no car waiting outside to take Rayya to rehab if she were swayed by the intervention. Rayya was furious. With everyone, but mostly with Liz Gilbert. Rayya insisted that the doctors had actually prescribed her something called, quote, medical grade cocaine from a secret research facility in New Jersey. Rayya also ended up screaming at Gilbert, quote, this one's tough, "Fuck off, Liz. I had a perfectly good fucking life before you stepped in and took control over everything. I wish we'd never gotten together. You threw yourself at me and I never should have agreed to it. You're way too much trouble to deal with, just like I always knew you would be. I wish we'd just stay friends, that way I could still have access to the good parts of you, but someone else could deal with all your emotional bullshit. Close quote. So Gilbert runs out of the room sobbing, crying, and everyone else at the intervention is like... So then Gilbert hits enter and ends the chapter with, "So yeah, that went well." So Gilbert calls this a death blow to her and Rayya's relationship, and she moves out and crashes on a friend's couch. Rayya continues to party in the penthouse with people who are willing to use with her, so Gilbert still paid the bills for Rayya and spent most of her days crying. Rayya also started talking shit on Gilbert to their friends, saying that she had bailed on her because she couldn't handle the cancer, so Gilbert also starts speaking poorly about Rayya as well. Then we get a poem in which God says to Gilbert, quote, "I can see that you are once more trying to convince yourself that you should have done better and known better. You are wondering why your mind goes where it goes, to all those dark and hateful places. Well, sweetheart, your mind goes where it goes because you're an addict." Close quote. Thank you, God. Gilbert speaks about addicts in this book as if they were a different class of people. She says things like, "Everybody feels pain, but for us addicts, that pain is unbearable." Some people in my book club are in recovery from substance addiction, and they consider recovery to be a big part of their lives. And most of the people who self-identified that way did not really like this book. And one of the reasons that one person gave and that someone else really agreed with was that she felt like Gilbert was excited and proud in this book to be able to consider herself an addict of something, as if she were happy to have found a justification for the things that she did. And I think that these moments of writing, when she speaks about people with addictions like they are somehow uniquely attuned to the pains of the world, regardless of whether or not you think that's true, contribute to a feeling that she might be using her credible diagnosis as a sex addict to maybe write off some things that happened in the past, or to fit in to what she sees as an exclusive in-group. Please note that this is not a personal critique. If Gilbert has found a sense of belonging and peace due to her diagnosis, then I'm happy for her. It is specifically a writing critique that I heard expressed from people in my book club as well who are in recovery. So Gilbert starts going to a 12-step program. She also starts taking some more accountability for her actions. She remembers when Rayya once said to a friend who had a brother with addiction problems, "You don't have a brother anymore." She writes, quote, "I felt like I was dealing with two Rayyas here. There was the Rayya of the present who was a cruel and destructive junkie, and then there was the Rayya of the past who had spent many years teaching me how to deal with cruel and destructive junkies in case I should ever encounter one. That's some real Obi-Wan Kenobi shit right there, and it was kind of blowing my mind." Close quote. So she called Rayya and asked to speak for 10 minutes, and Rayya agreed. Rayya sent away the people who she had been partying with, and Gilbert arrived to find the penthouse was completely trashed. Rayya was muttering to herself, pacing, tugging at her hair. Gilbert made herself a coffee and sat down and told Rayya to do whatever she needed to do substance-wise to be present for this conversation. So Rayya went to the bathroom and came back, and the women held hands, and Gilbert said, quote, "Rayya, I need to let you know that I can't be in this story anymore. It's doing too much damage to me." Close quote. Gilbert acknowledges and apologizes for her part in creating this mess of a relationship. She tells Rayya that it matters how a person dies, and she tells Rayya that she has lost all of her integrity and greatness. She tells Rayya that she's abusive, and that if the real Rayya were here, she would kill anybody who treated Liz like that. Then she tells Rayya that she's kicking her out. She needs to go. Gilbert says that she's getting her own place, and Rayya is the one who needs to figure out where to live. Rayya responds, quote, "But I'm dying. You can't abandon someone who's dying." Close quote. Gilbert replies, quote, "I hear you, and I accept that you're dying. I've been preparing for months to say goodbye to you, but this might be the moment when we have to say our goodbyes, because I won't stick around for what you've gotten yourself into." Close quote. Gilbert then tells Rayya that she loves her and she always will, but she can't be with her anymore. Rayya at first is silent, and then she says, quote, "Okay, man, I hear you." Gilbert replies, "Thanks, man." They hug and they tell each other, "We're good," and then Gilbert walks away. Okay, So Rayya, after she loses her home and her girlfriend in her final months of life, is in active addiction and has no options. So she calls her ex-girlfriend Stacey. Stacey and Rayya actually dated when Rayya was in active addiction the first time, but after Rayya got sober and mellowed out, her and Stacey reconnected and became dear friends. So Rayya called her ex Stacey and said, "I need your help." She told her the whole story, and Stacey said, quote, "Tell me what drugs you're on, and don't you dare bullshit me or I'll hang up on you." Close quote. Rayya told her. Stacey said, "What do you want me to do about all this?" Rayya said, "I want you to help me get clean." Stacey lived in Detroit where Rayya had grown up, so she told her, quote, "If you can get yourself to Detroit without dying or getting arrested, and if you're really serious about this, I'll help you, but I'm only giving you one chance." Close quote. And she hung up. As the reader at this point, I remember feeling like, finally an adult. Right around here is when the book starts to get better, I think. We still have the rough poems and drawings, but the storytelling chapters started to feel like less of a slog. Rayya filled her suitcase with drugs and, high out of her mind, somehow managed to fly to Detroit and show up at Stacey's door. Stacey wouldn't let her in unless she turned over all of her drugs, illegal and prescribed, and told Rayya that she would be administering her pharmaceuticals from now on. Rayya at first refused, and Stacey said, quote, "You can't manipulate me the way you used to or the way you've been manipulating Liz and her family lately. Frankly, I don't have the same level of emotional investment in you." Close quote. So Rayya agrees, turns over the drugs, and Stacey lets her in. Gilbert writes, quote, "What Stacey ended up running out of her home in the early autumn of 2017 was basically a private rehab clinic plus a hospice center," close quote. She describes how Stacey stayed up through the night to care for Rayya as she went through detox. She administered the correct doses of drugs and she flushed the rest. She brought Rayya to doctor's appointments. She got hospice nurses and social workers to come over every few days and help. She gave Rayya food and she got her to hydrate, and Gilbert was bitterly jealous. Stacey called Gilbert every day to keep her updated, but she would not let her come visit. She said, quote, "It might be better for everyone involved if you were not around Rayya at this very moment." Close quote. In my book club, someone on the call said that he wished Stacey was in more of the book, because if Gilbert gave us an example of how to not handle situations like this, then it would have been cool to read more about how Stacey managed to handle it so well, but I understand that Gilbert wasn't there at Stacey's behest. After Rayya went through detox and cleaned up, Stacey let her call Liz. Rayya was chipper and lucid, which made Liz feel like she was losing her mind. Gilbert was hoping that Rayya would apologize and cry and beg for forgiveness, but instead, Rayya said that she had zero recollection of the entire time that she was using. She says that she was with Liz and they were together in their apartment and in love, and then one day she woke up at Stacey's house with no memories of anything that she had done or said for the last few months. Gilbert was enraged by this, but also deeply grateful to Stacey for the way that she had stepped in when they both needed it. At the end of autumn in 2017, Stacey gives the lovebirds permission to see each other again. She warns Gilbert before she arrives that Rayya is starting to have cognitive symptoms, so she might not be as Gilbert remembered her. When Gilbert arrived, Rayya was in rough shape. The tumors were now visible on her torso, and she had become very thin due to the tumors consuming the nutrients she ate. But Gilbert writes, quote, "Still, she was gorgeous. Rayya had always been beautiful, but now she was luminous. Newborns have that look too, and sometimes the very elderly and the dying. It is the look of someone who has recently arrived here or who is soon to go home. The light of another world shining through." Close quote. I really loved that, and I found myself thinking about it for months after. The way that Gilbert jumps between expert writing and like cringy meme writing, really, it's giving me whiplash. At first, things felt awkward between Rayya and Gilbert. They asked each other small talk sorts of questions. Eventually, they got some privacy, and Rayya started telling Gilbert about what it felt like to die. She said, every night, either her mother or her father, who were both deceased at this point, would come visit her in her dreams. On one hand, it was comforting to see them again, but she said it also filled her with fear because she knew why they were there, and she didn't want to go to the other side with them yet. She also saw her grandmother in her dreams, who spoke to her in Aramaic, which Rayya hardly understood, and she was visited by ancestors whom she only recognized from photographs. She had a dream where her father was on his deathbed in the hospital, but he woke up and called her over, and he said that she should never let anyone tell her that she's a bad person because she is extraordinary. But Rayya rejected that thought, saying to her father, "But look at all the bad things that I did." Recounting this story to Gilbert, Rayya bursts into tears and she finally apologizes. She says that she fucked up everything between them and she had such a short amount of time to be with Gilbert, and she wasted it away. In this moment of tearful confession, Gilbert also confesses to Rayya that she tried to murder her. Rayya says, quote, "That's badass. That's fucking awesome. That's amazing. I'm so proud of you," close quote. They both start to laugh, and Gilbert says, "Wait, why are you proud of me?" And Rayya replies, "Because you found your darkness, dude." Gilbert says, "Will you really bring it forth in me?" And Rayya gives her a fist bump. I got the impression that Rayya was kind of relieved to not be the only person who did fucked up things in that relationship. Then Liz says that they need to talk about what actually happened between them so that she can get it off her chest. And she proceeds to tell Rayya everything that she did and said. Rayya is not surprised because she says, quote, "That's who I become when I'm a drug addict," close quote. Rayya then says that if they had more time, then she would go through all the steps of recovery and promises and do the work and make the apologies necessary to win Liz back. But she says bluntly that they don't have that kind of time. She just needs to know if Liz can forgive her. And Liz says that she can, and Rayya also forgives her. And they fall asleep together, quote, "holding hands like children," close quote. Gilbert writes that Rayya described a gathering happening on the other side, a coming together of ancestors and deceased loved ones getting ready to welcome her to the afterlife. Gilbert writes that a gathering was taking place in this world as well, with the living coming together to say goodbye to Rayya and to see her off. But Rayya was also back home again, and that comes with its own family tensions and uncomfortable moments. Gilbert writes, quote, "There were some really big personalities in the room, and I would love to say that we were all supportive of each other and gracious with each other as we faced our own suffering and each other's, but I can only report that sometimes we were supportive and gracious, and sometimes we were not. Sometimes grief can look like rage, as it turns out. Sometimes grief can look like territorialism, jealousy, and blame," close quote. The New York Times did report that one sister of Rayya's was not happy about this book and the way that it exposed Rayya. Alexandra Alter with the New York Times writes, quote, "In an interview, Elias's sister questioned some of the details, particularly the timeline of when Elias began to relapse, and said other parts felt embellished and exploitative, like when Gilbert detailed all the money she spent on Elias," close quote. Then we have a quote from this sister, quote, "We all knew from day one that a book was going to be written and money was going to be made out of my sister's death. To me, Rayya should not be on display," close quote. If it's true that the family knew from day one of Rayya's relationship with Gilbert, remember day one was the day that she got her cancer diagnosis, that Gilbert would write a book about her someday, then I could see where tensions might arise in these final days of Rayya's life when they are all essentially living in one house. Rayya's lucidity was fading, so she would sometimes seem very aware of her own death, and other times she would call friends and make plans for when we're back in New York. And then Gilbert wrote my favorite part of the whole book. Quote, "It was around this time that I began to understand at a much deeper level what it means to die, how you really do lose everything. I began to feel in my own heart all the things that Rayya would never do again. She would never drive a car again. She would never go to a restaurant again or cook a meal for herself again or be able to bathe or shower alone. She would never see another summer's day. She would never play the piano again. She would never get on an airplane again and head off into a new adventure. She would never make love again. She would never walk outside by herself again. She would never swim in an ocean again. She would never write another song. I was losing her, yes, but she was losing everything. Everything. Everything." Close quote. It's writing like that that gives you a newfound appreciation for life, even in the most mundane moments. Gilbert told the New York Times that these chapters, when Rayya passed, were the hardest for her to write, and she would often take long breaks to walk and cry and process what she was putting on paper. So I'm grateful to her for going through this process and still coming back to write about Rayya's death with a lot of tenderness. The two women rely on their spirituality a lot around this time, praying together. Rayya's prayers started to lift off the ground, becoming more dreamy and beautifully articulated. She says that dying like this is a burden, but it's also an honor, and so in her prayers she thanks God for that honor. There was a moment when Gilbert thought that Rayya would die, so she called in her ex-girlfriends, and 4 women lay down in the bed together, and they lit candles and they put on music. And then Rayya woke up and was like, "Why are you guys being so weird? Anyways, there's a sale at Lululemon I want to hit." And one of the exes quickly blows out all the candles so that they can take her to go buy leggings. But when it came time to actually die, Rayya was in a lot of pain and she refused to let go. Gilbert writes, quote, "I watched you die for 48 hours, Rayya," close quote. But when Rayya finally took her final breath, her face settled into an expression that can only be described as ecstasy. Gilbert then addresses Rayya, writing, quote, "My love, do you remember how I stayed with your body for hours after you took your last breath? Do you remember that part? Do you remember how you'd made me promise a few weeks earlier that I wouldn't leave your body alone after you died? And so I stayed there in the bed with you, holding you and kissing you and telling you stories. What a ride you took us on, Rayya, I told you. And I could hear your laughter. We washed your still warm body, these exhausted women who all loved you so much. We put clean clothes on you. Your sister and I joined hands and prayed over you. Somebody called the funeral home. Do you remember that part, Rayya? Did you see your own body as we took care of you? Did you hear us talking about you, Rayya? Or were you already gone? Were you still with us at that point, my love? Or were you already with them?" Close quote. Okay, so Rayya has now passed, and Gilbert moves back to New York to try to rebuild her life after Rayya. Now, Gilbert is not in a good spot. First, she's out of money. The divorce plus her hiatus from work plus her haphazard spending before Rayya died has emptied her account. Second, along with grieving Rayya and overcoming all the trauma from whatever the that was, she is also grieving a 10-year marriage, a divorce which it sounds like she hasn't processed. She also has stopped going to her programs for sex and love addiction. She says that once Rayya got clean and started being nice to her again, she no longer felt like she needed help for sex and love addiction. Also, her professional relationships have been suffering as well because she has a novel that she was supposed to turn in 1 year ago that she has not yet started to write. So the first thing she does is call her agent and ask her to fill her schedule with speaking events so she can go give life and creativity advice to people. Just 2.5 weeks after Rayya died, Gilbert was already doing speaking events. Her publisher gave her 6 months to finish her novel, City of Girls, and she wrote furiously, completing 3,000 words per day and finishing her book in about 6 months. For reference, for the non-writers among us, those are like Stephen King numbers. As she wrote, she lived in the church where Rayya had lived, and she wore Rayya's clothes, and she ate her food out of the freezer, and she spoke to Rayya constantly and heard her speak back. She writes, quote, "It was a very weird summer, weird in the Shakespearean sense of the word, eerie and haunted. For example, neighbors moved in next door and they had little kids and a dog named Rayya." So Gilbert would be writing and she would hear the kids outside going, "Rayya, Rayya." Gilbert says that she was sad with Rayya, but also enraged with her. Rayya had promised significant financial gifts to friends that Gilbert now had to pay off. She also paid off huge credit card bills that Rayya had racked up. Then the next chapter starts with this line, quote, "I took a lot of psychedelic drugs during the year after Rayya died." Like, lots and lots of psychedelic drugs, close quote. I read that line, I said out loud, Oh, because I think that can explain part of what happened with her writing style and her prose. Let's put a pin in that. So while Gilbert is living alone in this church and working on City of Girls, she is taking so many drugs that she hallucinates constantly. She saw Rayya as a big white tiger, as purple orbs, as a vibrating line representing music. So she takes ayahuasca and she talks to Rayya's cancer selves, who she says arrived in a tongue twister, a sheepish, shuffling cluster. And they said, we hate our job of being cancer, but it's our destiny. So around this time, Gilbert also started succumbing in a dramatic and desperate way to her sex and love addiction. It was publicly shared around this time that she was dating an ex-roommate and best friend of Rayya's who was a photographer, but she doesn't address that in the book. In fact, she says that she simply does not have the heart to write the details about what she did around this time and who she was with sexually. But it ended with so much distress and drama that she decided to go back into her 12-step programs. In these 12-step programs, she listens to people who have blown up marriage after marriage because of their addiction, people who lived through the same childhood trauma that Gilbert did, people who ruined other people's marriages, other people's relationships because of their sex addiction, people who couldn't keep a job because they would sleep with people at work, or who couldn't keep their money because as soon as it hit their account, they were spending it all on that special someone. So she gets a sponsor, and the first step is that she has to go no contact with anyone she's crushing on or interested in or talking to or even thinking about. She deleted a bunch of attractive people on social media. She also threw away a lot of Rayya's things. She said that her life started to feel deadly boring, to the point where she felt like crawling out of her skin. So she tried to replace her restlessness with healthy habits like working out and eating well. She starts going to meetings multiple times a day. She seems to have an obsessive personality. Although it wasn't her intention, Gilbert also stopped drinking around this time, and then she quit using drugs. She also hired a financial therapist who helped her develop healthier spending habits. After a year sober from sex and love, she found herself capable of meditating for hours and every day drawing and writing poetry. She stopped getting Botox. The pandemic came around this time and Gilbert became more like a monk or a recluse, throwing herself into her creativity. She wrote, quote, "And then, one miraculous afternoon, when the world was completely shut down and I was more alone with myself than I have ever been, I looked up and realized that I had somehow slid into the most peaceful, creative, happy, and spiritually rich season of my life, and I'd never seen it coming." Close quote. Although celibacy is not required in these programs, Gilbert chose to remain celibate. She shaved her head around this time, and she writes, quote, "Rayya would have hated this haircut on me, by the way. She liked her women to be soft and pretty and traditionally feminine. You know who else likes their women to be soft and pretty and traditionally feminine? Almost everybody in the world, as it turns out. But lately, I find that I do not care." Close quote. She has a plan that she made with her sponsor for if she wants to have sex again, what requirements she must follow to make sure that it's healthy, but she hasn't dated anyone else yet. She writes, quote, "Whenever I ask the God of my understanding if it's time for me to start dating again, the answer usually comes back the same, lol, no." Close quote. Then she tells the story about when she was teaching a course at a spiritual retreat center on a tropical island, and one of the rules in Gilbert's dating plans is that she can't fall in love with someone when she's traveling because on vacation, that's not really like the real them. But there was another teacher who was really sexy, and Gilbert was attracted to him as soon as she saw him. And he was looking too, he's looking, he liked what he saw. And that night, she went back to her room and she got a text from the handsome man. He said, "I'd like to invite you down to the beach for a late night drink. The stars are out, it's this gorgeous night, and I want to get to know you better. I really hope you'll say yes, because otherwise I'd be doomed to sit down here by the ocean all alone, thinking to myself, Elizabeth Gilbert is beautiful and amazing." And then Gilbert writes, quote, "Instantly, upon reading these words, a bitch forgot she doesn't drink." Close quote. I find it cringy when she talks like that. I know it's supposed to be funny, but maybe it's her age. Maybe I like my books to feel a little bit more like books. But anyways, so she gets this text and she immediately, like as if she's an autopilot, she starts getting ready to go meet him, like without thinking about it. And she puts her hand on the doorknob and she realizes what she's doing and she stops. She has a conversation with God in which God says, quote, "That is not your man, honey." Close quote. And after protesting and arguing with God and with Rayya's disembodied voice as well, she finally cedes and turns off her phone and she goes back to bed. She avoids him for the rest of the retreat, even though she really doesn't want to. And 3 months later, in the group chat with all the teachers from this retreat, the man shares a photo of his beautiful baby boy, who was just born to his gorgeous young wife. So while he was on a tropical island trying to sleep with the author of Eat, Pray, Love, his wife was 6 months pregnant. Drop the name of the retreat, Liz. I want to know the full government name of Mr. Spirit Guide. So then Gilbert writes a full chapter about her inner child. She now calls her inner child Lizzie, and she says that Lizzie is everything to her, and her primary goal in life is making sure that Lizzie is safe and calm and happy and loved, which is nice, that's nice. She repeats a prayer they say in her 12-step programs, which is, quote, "Dear God, thank you for all that has been given, for all that has been taken away, and for all that remains." I feel like she didn't know how to end this book because she ends it a few times. There's one poem for Rayya, a drawing that says, "Come in, sit down, it's over." And then another poem, this one supposedly, I guess, written or from Rayya, and then another drawing, that says, "Next year is next year's problem." Okay. We did it. We made it through. Let's discuss. You might know that the ancient Greeks used to do physical cleanses and purges in the baths, for example, by sweating in a sauna or a hot spring and letting all those toxins out. But did you know that the ancient Greeks also did emotional purges? In theater festivals, they used to watch 3 tragedies in a row so that everyone could cry and keen and grieve, and then they would end the day with a satyr, which was a short, irreverent comedy so that everyone could close the day laughing. In Aristotle's work, Poetics, he theorizes about why it can feel so cleansing, so healing, and ultimately so good to watch a tragic play. We watch Oedipus accidentally fuck his mom and then gouge out his own eyes, and we're like, I just feel so peaceful. Aristotle coined the term catharsis to explain this process, this purge of emotions like pity and fear. He theorizes that by watching this tragic work of art, you had the opportunity to release emotions that you had been holding in during your real personal life. But catharsis can only take place if a work of art is created very, very particularly. Think of the sauna as an example. If the sauna is too hot, or if the work of art is too disturbing and too real, then people don't even want to go into the sauna, just like they wouldn't want to engage with that work of art. If the sauna isn't hot enough, or if the work of art doesn't feel real or sad enough, then that sauna is just a muggy room, and it makes people uncomfortable, and the work of art just feels corny and forced, like it's trying to make you cry, but not quite getting there. Someone I love very much, who is very private and who watches these videos, but she's in my nuclear family, was first diagnosed with multiple types of cancer when I was 20, and then unfortunately had another recurrence just a few months ago. I'm sure many of you watching this have also had these close encounters with cancer through yourself or a loved one. It's really unbelievable how many people this disease touches. As a result of my personal experiences, I have very high standards for art that deals with cancer. Because if I'm reading something that's just entertaining, then I can escape my real life. I can't do that if I'm reading about something that's related to cancer, because that book will remind me at every turn about my real life. And that is fine if the book is so well written that catharsis takes place. But as I said, in order for catharsis to take place, the author has to strike a very particular balance. The emotional dealings have to be just so, like Goldilocks' porridge or the perfect sauna. I feel like if the author is going to take me there to the point where I'm thinking about these very real, very painful topics, then I want them to have the skill to write something so beautiful and so true that I can end the day laughing at the satyr. I can get lost in the prose, that feeling of Yes, life is hard, but at least we have poetry. My desire for catharsis, plus the fact that Elizabeth Gilbert is such a celebrated author, meant that I was going into this book with very high standards for the quality of the book as a piece of literature. So imagine going through the beginnings of the emotional process of being reminded of morality, of cancer, of caretaking, and you flip the page hoping for some level of emotional release, and what you find is the following poem. Your name is somebody. Somebody around here needs to change. Your name is somebody. That's a 2-line poem from a career writer in which the title of the poem is the second line. Instead of catharsis taking place, the reader's emotions get stunted and it feels like a zit that didn't pop or sex without an orgasm. It's like, if you weren't going to finish the job, I would have preferred if you didn't start in the first place. Because now those suppressed emotions from my real life are at the surface but not released. In this review, I am going to try to focus on a critique of the book's writing more than I am focusing on Gilbert's personal decisions. And there are a few reasons for that. One, I think that the marketing of this book, either intentionally or unintentionally, dramatized the events that happened in the book, and in some cases maybe even misled readers, which we'll get into in a second. And two, if your book is very well written, you can put the readers in your shoes and they can empathize with nearly anything. So while I do think that Gilbert made many bad decisions in this book, and I think that she would agree, by the way, I only intend to comment on them when I think that they ultimately ended up hurting the quality of the writing of the book. So let's first talk a little bit about the way that this book was marketed and how in some ways we were sort of sold a lie. Maybe I wouldn't go that far, but there was a lot of emphasis placed on the fact that Elizabeth Gilbert planned to kill Rayya at one point. A reminder, Tolentino wrote in her review, quote, "Losing the faith, Gilbert decides to murder Rayya, literally, by switching her morphine pills with sleeping pills and covering her in fentanyl patches, a plot that fails only because Rayya somewhat demonically cottons on to the plan and thwarts it." Close quote. I read that quote and I thought that Elizabeth Gilbert physically covered Rayya in fentanyl patches. The following quote from Elizabeth Gilbert was also published in Instagram posts from, I think it was the New York Times, Modern Love. Quote, "I'm the nice lady who wrote Eat, Pray, Love, and I came very close to premeditatedly and cold-bloodedly murdering my partner," close quote. Then you read the book and you realize that it's not technically correct to say that she attempted to murder Rayya. She thought about killing Rayya. So when I got to that part of the book, I actually went back into my previous video. I made like a teaser video for this longer review that you're watching now. And I had the initial title as Elizabeth Gilbert tried to kill her girlfriend. And I changed it to Elizabeth Gilbert planned to kill her girlfriend. And I actually went in and cut out some portions of the video to the point where there were people commenting like, "Is part of this video missing?" And then I got to the end of the book and Gilbert herself writes that she told Rayya that she tried to kill her. So now I'm like, pause. How far did this plot get? Did it get farther than just thinking and you're trying to cover your tracks, or did we exaggerate what actually happened in the marketing materials so that we could sell a more dramatic story? Publishers know as well as you and I that if a book has more dramatic or salacious elements, then it will sell more copies, and I understand that. Someone in my book club made the point that you can't think that writing and art are important, difficult, and worthwhile, and also think that artists don't deserve to make good money off their art. Those ideas are mutually exclusive. But I think that the decision to focus so much on Elizabeth Gilbert's plot to kill Rayya when we were selling this book was at best strange and at worst kind of exploitative toward Rayya. I don't know how much of a say Gilbert had in how her book was marketed, but I will say that, and this is often the case with very financially successful women, Gilbert is probably more of a businesswoman than we might intuitively give her credit for. In interviews and in her books, she almost has this persona that floats through life and has her head in the clouds, but Gilbert doesn't just know how to write books. She knows how to sell books. I'll give you an example. I saw an interview with Elizabeth Gilbert in which she talked about people coming up to her at book signings after Eat, Pray, Love and saying, "Wow, I wish that I could drop everything and go travel the world and discover myself, but XYZ, I'm a caretaker, I have kids, I'm paycheck to paycheck, etc. And Gilbert said that she always responds to them and says, but you can do it. You can be like me. She also wrote in Eat, Pray, Love that she bankrolled her trip by selling everything she owned and living frugally off her savings. And then again, in All the Way to the River, she said that she went on that trip because she was following the voice of God. But that's not the whole story. The part of Eat, Pray, Love that often gets left out is that her trip was funded by a $200,000 advance from her publisher. I think that Gilbert deserved that money in the sense that she had already proved herself as a writer, plus Penguin made dividends off that initial investment. It was a wise and forward-thinking investment on their part. But this version of Eat, Pray, Love, where a brave lady packs her bags and fucks off on a cloud to eat gelato, is more fiction than might initially meet the eye. And maybe the All the Way to the River equivalent here is that the publishers and Gilbert decided to sell this narrative of she was a nice author lady until she got a taste for blood. And to be fair, it seems like it worked. I mean, I read the book out of morbid curiosity and it was on the nonfiction bestseller list. But I wanted to include an important caveat that if it is true that Gilbert only thought about killing Rayya, then I really want to avoid criticizing her for those thoughts, and I'll tell you why. First, thoughts of hurting the person who you're caring for is unfortunately a very common symptom of caregiver burnout. And if you're a caregiver for someone and you have thoughts like that, I want you to know that you're not a freak or a monster, but you should seek support, and I'll leave some resources in the video description. Second, when my family member, whom I mentioned, was going through cancer the first time, I started experiencing intrusive thoughts. My intrusive thoughts were more focused on myself and my own body than they were on other people, but there is perhaps something about watching someone very genetically similar to you go through something that is so physical and focused on their body that can trigger these disturbing intrusive thoughts. And if somebody is having thoughts like that, then one of the worst things that you can do is try to stop them by telling them what they are or are not allowed to think. So I am personally very against thought policing in a religious context, in a relationship, because if you have an intrusive thought and you think, oh, well, random neurons firing happens to everyone, then often the thought doesn't stick as much as if you have an intrusive thought and then you think, what is wrong with me? What kind of sadist would think something like that? So thought policing and thought punishing are counterproductive. I say this not necessarily for Elizabeth Gilbert's sake. You can debate the morality of what we know about her personal actions in the comments, but for the sake of anyone who might be watching this or who might have seen the marketing of this book and who is thinking, my gosh, everyone hates Elizabeth Gilbert because she thought about killing somebody and I thought about killing somebody, I must be a bad person. In reality, and despite what this book's marketing framed it as, doing something and thinking something are very different. There is also the possibility that Elizabeth Gilbert did make more progress in her plan than she wrote about, and she's hinting at it with these quotes about coming very close to killing Rayya, but either way we will never know, so we can only judge the events of the book based on the little window into her life that Gilbert opened up for us. Also in her case, there's the fact that she didn't just think about it, she wrote about it, and I think that this could be disturbing to people who loved Rayya, who knew Rayya, but I definitely just wanted to include that little caveat for people who might experience caregiver burnout, for people who might experience intrusive thoughts. This is a very different situation, and the critique that I'm sending towards her and the critiques that you may see towards her in the comments probably don't apply to what you're experiencing. As I said earlier, there's another reason that I want to prioritize criticizing the text as opposed to criticizing her personal actions, and this reason has to do with two questions that a college professor used to ask our class anytime we finished a new book. First, he would say, "Did you like it?" And then he would say, "Was it good?" He did this to separate the two concepts in our young minds as we were learning how to analyze literature. Maybe something was well written, but you didn't enjoy it personally. Or maybe you enjoyed something immensely, but you recognized that it wasn't really well written. I would add a third question to modern media discourse, and that is, did you like the author? I would add that question not because I think it's relevant if you like the author personally, but to train your mind to distinguish your personal distaste for a writer from the quality of the writing itself. If anyone watching this went to art school or any kind of creative school, you probably know firsthand that sometimes people who you don't like at all are really talented. There are still people who I stopped speaking to years ago, and I'll still follow them on social media, and I'll see some like piece of art that they created or a video or performance or something that they made, and I'll be like, damn, that's tasteful. So even if I didn't like Elizabeth Gilbert as a character in this book, I still think that she could have written a great book. That said, something that I'm always coming back to in this channel is that the decisions that you make in life inevitably influence the art that you create. My first video was a review of an essay called The Case for Marrying an Older Man, in which the author's decision to attempt to marry into the life that she wanted instead of building the life that she wanted through personal know-how and grit seemed to have stunted her maturation, leading to a writing voice that came across as very childish and small-minded and that was heavily criticized online. I reviewed an essay about Cormac McCarthy's past of grooming teenagers, and I pointed out how these vulnerable, attractive teenage girls just kept showing up as love interests in the books that he wrote. In this book, All the Way to the River, I see a few ways that Gilbert's decisions in life have changed the way that she writes. In going over these changes, I hope to answer the central question I posed at the beginning of this video of what happened. Let's start with a close reading of two paragraphs, one from Eat, Pray, Love and one from All the Way to the River. First, in Eat, Pray, Love, Gilbert was talking about learning Italian, and she wrote, quote, "Every word was a singing sparrow, a magic trick, a truffle for me. I would slosh home through the rain after class, draw a hot bath, and lie there in the bubbles reading the Italian dictionary aloud to myself, taking my mind off my divorce pressures and my heartache. The words made me laugh in delight." Close quote. Walter Pater, an English writer considered one of the great stylistic prose writers, wrote, quote, "All art constantly aspires towards the condition of music." Close quote. Well-written prose sounds musical. It has a rhythm, a melody, a lyricism. You can hear it in that first quote. Now, contrast that prose with this quote from All the Way to the River. Quote, "We would love each other so hard that loss and pain would no longer have any power over us, and then our love would build a bridge across the cosmos, far beyond the reach of suffering, where we could meet each other in the eternal realm as beings made of light." New line. "We were formless, ageless, fearless, and gorgeous," in italics. New line. "We were lit." Close quote. The first thing I'm noticing is that her prose has become less physical, less sensual, and more conceptual. She's describing ideas in the spiritual realm, so she doesn't conjure up the same images and sounds of sloshing through the rain and submerging yourself in a hot bubble bath. As a result, she's relying more on adjectives than nouns. You can't feel, see, or hear the words ageless, fearless, and gorgeous in the same way that you hear a singing sparrow or you taste a truffle. If all writing aspires to the condition of music, then any rhythm or chord progression that she built with "we were formless, ageless, fearless, and gorgeous" was ruined by "we were lit." Like a cat jumping on a keyboard. The adjectives were weaker to begin with, without her throwing in a slang word that I used to use to describe fun parties with my a cappella group in 2015. How does that relate to her personal life? I can't help but feel like her addiction to psychedelics had something to do with this change. A lot of writers and artists have this fear that if they overcome their addiction or overcome their mental illness, then their art might suffer. And often audiences can play into that belief by joking about how when artists get happy, all of a sudden their art sucks, or when they get clean, their art gets boring. I think these types of claims can be remarkably damaging for artists. So I'm glad to make the case here that I think that drugs actually made her writing worse. Substances, if used responsibly, augment reality, but when abused, they make you leave reality. And many people turn to drugs for exactly that reason. They don't want to live in reality anymore. That is how Elizabeth Gilbert was using substances in the wake of Rayya's death in this book. She didn't want to deal with what her life had become, so she preferred to trip constantly. But so much of what made her initial writing style special was her ability to engage with and describe her physical reality: food, sex, nature, cities, and what it's like to inhabit a body in a pleasurable way. So when her abuse of psychedelic drugs takes her out of the physical realm, then the writing loses a lot of what made it so interesting to read. She went from building reality in her books to escaping reality. We go from tasting the pizza alongside her and feeling the bubbles of the bubble bath to reading about purple orbs that she hallucinated. And the truth is that alienates a lot of readers, and in general it makes for a much less aesthetic reading experience. The other thing that I would call a fatal flaw of this book is the way that she wrote it almost like a speech. And I noticed in my book club meeting that people who listened to the audiobook seemed to enjoy it a lot more than people who read it. But because reading it, there was a huge over-reliance on italics. The paragraphs were very short, often just a sentence or a few words, so it read almost more like a search engine optimized blog instead of a book. I don't know if Gilbert was trying to sound like Rayya, or perhaps she has written so many speeches at this point that she wanted this book to sound more like a speaking engagement. Tolentino's theory was that maybe the travel blog writing style that Gilbert influenced so much is now beginning to influence her. That's also a possibility. But I think that part of the reason for this choppy, italicized writing style could have to do with how Gilbert approaches relationships. Stay with me. Gilbert has been criticized for Orientalism extensively. I feel that she has a tendency to turn non-white characters into these almost mythical creatures. Orientalism was a term coined by the Palestinian literary critic Edward Said, and he used Orientalism to describe the depiction of the Orient in Western media. In reality, he said the Orient is an invention by Western media instead of a real place, because what the West would refer to as the Orient is in reality a combination of hundreds of different countries, all with very distinct cultures. But Western media sums them up into one magical place that can usually be described as exotic, mysterious, sensual, and dangerous. I think it's worth noting that those are all words that I would use to describe Gilbert's perception of Rayya in this book. I almost got the sense that Gilbert saw Rayya as a mythical figure herself. She did literally call her exotic, even though she was like pretty much from Detroit.
I think my main issue wasn't with the decision she was making, even though obviously they're there and they provide a sort of shock value. I think it was the way she wrote about it. I found her completely immature, and I found the writing to be immature. And like he was saying about Rayya, I felt like she became a caricature. She was a completely flat character for me. Like I can picture that she was maybe a very interesting person in real life and that she was charismatic, but only because it was told to me that she was charismatic and that people found her that way, not because she leapt off the page in any way for me. I felt like Rayya was the same way that she wrote about God is the way that she wrote about Rayya, someone who affirms her and is kind to her, but ultimately doesn't exist as a fully realized character to themselves. And I don't think she's evil by any means, but I do think maybe it's that thing that people say that you kind of get maybe stagnated at the age you become famous. And I think maybe there's an element of that. She seems much younger than she is in real life. But I just heard by the end of the book, it's interesting to me that a few people said that the end of the book they found better, because I found it strange that she sort of walked back all of the things that she said earlier. She said that she controlled people with money, and then at the end of the book she said almost affirmation style that she wasn't going to let people use her as a purse. And I thought that was a really strange thing to say after admitting that you use money to keep people in your life.
And it takes two to tango. I got the sense from the book that Rayya liked maintaining this image in front of Gilbert of this tough guy with a bad attitude who wasn't afraid of anything. But as the reader, I felt from essentially the first chapter that Rayya was a deeply vulnerable and hurting person who used that over-the-top badass image to kind of like protect herself. And when Gilbert and Rayya were just besties, it was probably easier for Rayya to maintain that seductive, dark, exotic, and mysterious image. But when they got together, Rayya crumbled under the circumstances, understandably, and that mask came off pretty quickly. So there were scenes where, for example, Gilbert was surprised that Rayya was afraid to die. And I thought, well, sure, she's human. Not only that, but she was a very troubled human. And when you're in a long-term relationship with someone, then you see them at their best, their worst, and everything in between. And if your relationship is strong, then you love each other regardless. What Gilbert's addiction caused her to do was to become obsessed with the image of a person and put that image on a pedestal and worship it, and then become disillusioned when that person inevitably proved to be a person and not a character in a book. One thing I kept coming back to with Rayya is that she had this huge family and a huge chosen family, and we didn't really hear about them that much. And you never know, on the side of the reader, there might have been people who are very private who didn't want Gilbert to talk about them. But like a couple examples, I mean, there was one scene when they thought that Rayya was dying and Gilbert and Stacey curled up in bed with her to hold her while she passed away. And there was a third woman there, another ex-girlfriend of Rayya's, who we knew almost nothing about.
I'm not sure if anyone else is familiar in the queer community, but the ending where it's like, yeah, I'm surrounded by my wife, my ex-wife, and my girlfriend. Yeah, that sounds right.
So this is someone who was holding Rayya as she died, and we essentially only know her first name. It sounds like people very close to Rayya had complex feelings about this book and about her relationship with Gilbert and how her final months played out. It sounds like Rayya and Gilbert blew off all of their relationships so that they could party for those last few months, and then when shit hit the fan, Gilbert left. And the people who really had those long-term relationships with Rayya were the ones who were left to pick up the pieces. And I think it's telling that Rayya ultimately decided to leave New York and die in Detroit with her family and close friends, who straight up told Gilbert to not come visit. All of this is to say that I felt that Gilbert was struggling in the writing to show the depth of her relationship with Rayya because their romantic relationship was so short-lived and some of it was very infatuation-based. And so she had to rely on telling us, Rayya loved no one else more than me. I was the most important person in Rayya's life. I was her all the way to the riverfront. Literally, the title of this book is an insistence that Gilbert was the most important person in Rayya's life. So when the plot of the story and the language of the story lacks that evidence, that meat, that proof of depth in the relationship, then we end up relying too much on adjectives in lieu of verbs, on italics, and on other techniques like repetition in an attempt to convince the reader that there is more depth to the story than there actually is. Gilbert also found herself relying often on speaking for Rayya. She says, Rayya said this to me in a vision. Rayya said this to me while I was tripping. Here is a poem that Rayya wrote from beyond the grave that she wanted me to share with you. And we discussed for a while in my book club if that is fair to Rayya. And you could make the argument that Rayya appears in the book as someone who wanted to be famous, who got excited when they were going to make a documentary about her, who didn't want to die and wanted to be remembered. But ultimately, we do not know how Rayya would feel about this book. And I was realizing as I'm writing this review that she may be represented more in this book through Gilbert's words than through her own words. If I were a family member or loved one of Rayya's, this is the aspect of the book that would make me the most uncomfortable. These entire chapters of Gilbert speaking for Rayya. And in those chapters, often what Rayya is saying is that Gilbert didn't do anything wrong and that she loves the book. And I don't think that we can credibly make that claim. Gilbert also does a lot of speaking for God in this book, and I'm not criticizing the spiritual element of writing the voice of God or a scene with a ghost or a deceased person in a nonfiction book. I'll actually give an example of someone who I thought did that well in a minute. But here's something that my dad always used to repeat. I have no problem with people who say they speak to God. Hell, I don't even have a problem with people who say God speaks back. I start having a problem when people try to speak for God. And I agree with that perspective because it seems like when people start speaking for God, and this is what happened in the book, conveniently God is always telling them to do what they already wanted to do anyway. I understand that Gilbert is doing inner child work with these poems from God, in part to heal a specific childhood trauma that she's chosen not to discuss, but as a narrative technique, it immediately undermines any work that she does in the prose chapters to take accountability for her own actions, because it ends up sounding like, I did some really heinous shit. But God says I'm just a baby.
I'm a baby.
And that's another narrative technique that didn't work, that possibly came from personal decisions that she made in her life. What Rayya needed and what Gilbert needed during this phase of time portrayed in this book wasn't for Gilbert to get more in touch with herself as a child or to get more in touch with the spirit realm. She was already acting like a much younger person. She was already communicating with the voice of God constantly. Every human who belongs to a society has parts of themselves that they hide from that society. Carl Jung called this the shadow self. If society expects you to be polite, calm, quiet, and submissive, then your shadow self would probably be the parts of you that are violent and angry and sexual. If society expects you to be tough, violent and unbothered, then your shadow self might be the parts of you that are vulnerable and afraid. Often the more you try to suppress and hide the shadow self, the stronger she becomes. As Carl Jung wrote, quote, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate," close quote. I had heard this quote before, and then I was reminded of it by the book The Tell by Amy Griffin. And then I got to the end of the book, and there's like this revelation where you find out that Carl Jung never actually said that quote. It was a misattribution, but I'm leaving it in because it fits so well in my script. So the best, most psychologically healthy thing you can do is to look directly at the parts of yourself that make you uncomfortable, those traits that you were told are bad or evil or weak, and learn how to harness them, to have the grace to know when to release them, understanding that the shadow self too is a part of you and is there for a reason. I would argue that the best writers are well acquainted with their shadow selves, to the point where they can joke about them and play with them in their prose. In fact, to write a truly honest memoir, I would argue that the writer must be in touch with their shadow self. Plus, in general, being able to be good to other people and being a helpful, positive member of society doesn't come from just self-flagellating and harping on all the terrible things you are and did. It also means being aware of your own power, your own strength. A person who can talk about themselves like a child, while bit by bit taking complete control over another person's life, is a very dangerous person. And I do think that Gilbert really tried to have a reckoning with her own strength and manipulative tendencies in this book. But I personally never 100% bought it. I also really never liked the writing that framed it as a huge shock that a doe-eyed blondie from Connecticut could think of killing someone. We all have a shadow self, and the fact that she ever thought herself the exception, especially on the basis of the color of her hair or her being from a very wealthy state, generates a lot of distrust in me. I also felt that Gilbert hasn't fully come to terms with her shadow self because instead of sharing this book with a linear timeline, she tells us something that she did, and then from the very beginning, she writes pages and pages of justification for what she did. Well, Rayya thinks that it was okay. Well, I was an addict. Well, love addiction is real and legitimate. Well, I had an unhealed inner child. It actually would have been more bearable to read these stories if she just presented them as what happened and not felt the need to write a book that was 2/3 her making questionable decisions and 1/3 her justifying those questionable decisions. The famous author David Sedaris was 35 when his mother passed away, and then in 2013, his little sister Tiffany took her own life. He writes a lot about Tiffany and their complex relationship in his 2018 short story collection, Calypso. In his short story, The Spirit World, he writes about how his late mother and sister come to visit him in his dreams. He says he doesn't believe in ghosts, but there is an element to these dreams that he can't explain. He says the only way he can phrase it is that it doesn't feel like a normal dream. It's different. It's like it really is his mom. The other interesting thing about these dreams is that his mom doesn't come visit to tell him important lessons about life or make some huge gesture. She isn't like, buy Bitcoin. She mostly wants to hear about him. She asks him questions. She wants to learn about his life and what she's missed. And I think this is an important distinction. Although Sedaris is writing the voice of a dead person, he doesn't speak for her, as I felt Gilbert did for Rayya. In fact, us readers found out from Sedaris' most recent book, Happy Go Lucky, that there were some particular traumas from his past that played a hand in Tiffany's demise that he was waiting to publish until after his father died. You might be seeing the parallels between Gilbert's situation. And I felt that he spoke about those traumas without ever speaking for Tiffany or insisting on how she should feel or shouldn't feel. He even wrote about the cruel things that he did to his little sister without 2 chapters, a poem, and a drawing afterwards justifying those cruel things by pathologizing himself or forgiving himself from the perspective of God. So in fact, if you were disappointed by aspects of All the Way to the River, for example, if you didn't find it super funny, or if you didn't feel that Gilbert was in touch with her shadow self in the writing, as I mentioned earlier, then you might want to check out David Sedaris. I feel that he takes some of these tools that Gilbert was trying to employ and he wields them expertly. My favorite is Dress Your Family and Corduroy and Denim, and then Calypso and Happy Go Lucky go more into details about more recent grief and aging and the family trauma that I mentioned, but they do it with a lot of dark humor, and I felt that I achieved catharsis through reading them. I'll link in the description. One more thing that once made Elizabeth Gilbert's writing great is what Gia Tolentino called her Epiphanies. In my previous teaser video, I said if you haven't read Elizabeth Gilbert, then you have likely read her style of writing, even if it was just in an Instagram post. It's a little bit edgy, it's an open confessional, it's followed by a revelation, often spiritual in nature. It's like a memoir plus a self-help book. And when that structure works, it works very well. There's a scene in Eat, Pray, Love when she's in Italy and she's been indulging in so much gelato and pizza and pasta that she gains about 15 pounds and she realizes she doesn't fit into her new jeans. So instead of starting a new diet, her and her Swedish friend Sophie go buy bigger jeans to accommodate their new joyful bodies. And when I tell you that in 2006, we all needed to hear that. But when the structure doesn't work, it suffocates the writing. The writing becomes redundant, often irritatingly so. And All the Way to the River, anytime Gilbert made a decision or something difficult happened to her, I just already knew that in the coming paragraph she was going to wrap it up with some neat realization about life that often felt very forced to me, or even surface level or obvious, like she felt like she needed to say something profound. I really liked this story when Gilbert is invited to the bar by the handsome man at the spiritual retreat and she ignores his text and later finds out that he had a pregnant wife at home. But while I was reading it, I kept thinking, this sounds so familiar. And then I remembered that I read an essay by Gilbert in the New York Times Magazine called Confessions of a Seduction Addict. In this essay, she explains what a rush she once got from seducing people away from their wives and girlfriends, how intoxicating it was, how powerful it made her feel to know that a man on the other side of town, lying next to his wife, couldn't sleep because he wished he was with her. She wrote, quote, "I knew that I didn't need to be prettier or better than his existing girlfriend. I just needed to be different. The trick was to study the other woman and to become her opposite, thereby positioning myself to this man as a sparkling alternative to his regular life." Close quote. She writes about the process of getting divorced from her first husband, and before the divorce was even finalized, she had already had a bitter breakup with the boyfriend whom she had left her husband for. And then here is how the essay ends. Quote, "I forced myself to admit that I had a problem, indeed, that I was a problem. I hated that it took me almost 20 years to realize this. There are 16-year-olds who know better than to behave this way. It felt shameful. But once I got it, I really got it. There's no way to stop a destructive behavior except to stop. I spent the next 6 months celibate and serious, working with a good therapist, trying to learn if I even existed at all when I wasn't blazing in the heat of somebody's longing gaze. And then one afternoon, I ran into a guy I liked. We went for a long walk in the park, flirted, laughed. It was sweet. Eventually, he said, 'Would you like to come back to my apartment with me?' I said, 'You know what, my friend? I don't think I'm ready for this.' He said, 'No problem, let's get Italian ices instead.' We spent a few more pleasant hours together and then said our goodbyes. I walked away alone, but calm. And that's when I realized that the better part of my life had already begun." Close quote. That essay was published in 2015. That is before Gilbert left her second husband and before she and Rayya were together romantically. I do not know Elizabeth Gilbert personally, so maybe this time it's true that she really figured it out. But I think you can see how as a reader, this cycle of realizing things it stops being quite as pleasurable to read about and starts just feeling like you're stuck in a time loop. If I hadn't met with my book club and met people who genuinely loved this book, then the review would stop here, but there are a few points brought up by some of my book club members that I wanted to leave here. One member named Luisa, she takes a more pedagogic, postmodernist approach to reading. She questions if good writing even exists. Gilbert should be allowed to put this book out there, especially because it's a memoir. And I really liked that take, even though I think I disagree with it. Whenever I do a critique of a memoir, I get a lot of comments that say, but this is a memoir, why are you criticizing it? It's just a single person expressing themselves, so let them express themselves. But ultimately, we all have limited time in this world and a limited amount of time to read. So as much as we wish we could, we can't read every book in the world. So we need some metric to decide what is worthwhile and which book we want to pay for and spend the many hours required to get through it. And if there is no literary standard for which books are worthwhile, then oftentimes the consumerist market will determine what a good book is, and the books with the highest marketing budget will simply be the ones that the most people read and the most people like. So that's my defense of my right to turn my nose up at this book. I'm not saying she had no right to write it, but that doesn't mean that I have to read it or recommend it. But maybe you'll like Luisa's take better, so I'll let her share it in her own words because I found her to be very articulate.
I also appreciate the people saying positive things about this book, and I appreciated the distinction that you made between like, is it good and do I like this person? I want to offer a third path, which is like, is it good? Do I like this person? And is this a rich text? Which I feel like I felt like I was drawn to it because it felt like a really rich text, both the book itself, and I was also just drawn in by, I don't think I would have read it had it not been for its reception. So I'm just like really interested in like the things that women have to say about their lives, and like when the things that they have to say about their lives are like overwhelmingly rejected by a group of people. And it felt like there was a tone of like certainly like moral condemnation as well as literary condemnation in the reception of this book. So I just found that really interesting. And I think a lot about Virginia Woolf when she writes about like women just like writing shit, like regardless of whether it's good, just the importance of all women writing, just so that we can like start establishing a canon, because we don't have one. You know, we've only had our work published for a couple hundred years. So I'm happy anytime a woman publishes a book, not to be too like #lean in. I feel like that's all that like a lot of times her work is like criticized as like being authoritative in a way that I don't think that she's like claiming for herself. Like Eat, Pray, Love is often criticized as an advice book, which it was billed as a travel memoir. And I feel like for the most part, like all Elizabeth Gilbert has ever done is sort of like offer her effective experience without really making any claims about it other than like, this is how I feel and this is how I dealt with it. Crazy, you know? So I feel like kind of just like I want to defend her right to do that. That's kind of how I feel about like the inconsistency of the quality of the writing, which like I'm skeptical about that idea. Like I'm kind of like a postmodernist, like what is good writing? But like I can see what people are talking about when they say that. And I feel like some people have mentioned already, she already like said like within the text, like I'm writing poetry because I'm bad at it. I'm making these drawings with my left hand. Like I don't know how many other people have read The Artist's Way, but it kind of just felt like she read The Artist's Way and she was like, all right, I'm fucking doing this. Most of us, I think, who are writers or creators in some way, like try to do that. Like we try to practice some form of creation without attachment to the quality of the outcome, but we all secretly hope that it'll be good anyways, right? And I feel like I can't really fault her for like doing what The Artist's Way told us all to do. And it's hard for me to like not feel a little sad when I hear, or just, you know, just reading like the overwhelming response to this book in a lot of spaces. Like, I mean, I'm not necessarily like discounting the craft of the literature criticism at all, but I want there to be a world where like we all feel more free to play creatively. And I feel sad for like the potential woman reader who like reads this, admires it, like relates to it deeply, and then like reads these reviews and feels like, oh shit, I should keep my shit to myself. Like don't keep it to yourself.
Another point that Luisa made that I liked was that it is just crazy to read how this wealthy white woman handed her audience essentially a loaded gun to cancel her. And in response, I found myself wondering if the relationship that Gilbert has with her audience is similar to the relationships that she once had with partners when she was in active love addiction. The relationship that the artist has with her audience replicates a romantic relationship in many ways. How many people start a career in the arts to impress someone? How many musicians practice their songs imagining their crush in the audience? While the artist would twist himself into shapes just to impress the audience or the reader, that same audience remains in many ways mysterious to him. This creates a sense of longing, a desire to be accepted and celebrated by an audience that you can never fully understand. So it would make sense that Gilbert, or any writer, would treat their audience the same way that they would treat a lover. In the case of this book, Gilbert said to the audience, here, take it all. Take my therapy drawings and my darkest memories and my most embarrassing confession. Regardless of all my critiques, I am still so grateful to Gilbert for writing this book and being honest about what end-of-life care can look like. The doctor in my book club basically pointed out that as far as dramas that you see working in palliative care go, this one is actually quite vanilla. And it's a good point. A lot of people who once struggled with addiction and who relapse when they get a terminal diagnosis end up alienating a lot of their loved ones, and they go through their final months alone. There must have been something pretty special about Rayya, if after all those years and all those mistakes, she still passed away in a house full of people, both living and dead, who loved her. A lot of people living through caretaking, through grief, through sex addiction, and through many of the other difficult themes that are talked about in this book feel overwhelmed by guilt and loneliness. The fact that these topics are taboo and that many people don't have the courage or the reach to write about stories like this for a large audience exacerbates those feelings of guilt and loneliness. Gilbert broke through that taboo. She knew that hundreds of thousands of people would read her most disturbing thoughts, her worst moments. And she put fingers to keyboard and she wrote regardless. Gilbert went for decades to therapists, to spiritual leaders, to gurus, to counselors, and everything in between to beg them, please tell me what is wrong with me. Help me. And no one, despite her patterns of behavior, ever said to her that she might be a sex and love addict until she was almost 50. I am almost certain that there are people who are in active love addiction who won't realize it until they read this book. And when they do read this book, they might finally get the help that they need, or at the very least, they won't feel so lonely. And that goes beyond the value of a popular book, and it will become, I predict, a major part of Elizabeth Gilbert's legacy. I mentioned earlier that I have a very close loved one who has been affected by cancer, and when she first got diagnosed, I relied a lot on unhealthy coping mechanisms to get through that time. This person ended up beating the multiple types of cancer that she'd been diagnosed with, but she had a recurrence earlier this year. Fortunately, we caught it early and she beat that one too. But when this recurrence happened a few months ago, I was terrified that I would fall back into those old habits. I've done so much work to leave them behind. But sometimes a work of literature comes into your life at exactly the right moment, like the universe handed it to you as a tool. And around that time, I read an article in The New Yorker about a concept called post-traumatic growth. You've probably heard about PTSD, but PTSD has a less famous sibling called post-traumatic growth. Sometimes when people go through something hard, they become not just more resilient, but it's this other effect. They become more grateful and more calm in life, more appreciative of life. It was instrumental for me to read that article and hear that the trauma that my family was going through at that time wasn't some sort of death sentence. And even though I couldn't control what happened to us, I could control how I responded to it. I wasn't somehow fated to suffer. I could use healthy coping mechanisms. I didn't have to try to escape reality. I realized that a lot of the things that once caused me to suffer in the longer term were bad habits that I developed as a reaction to an initial trauma, not the trauma itself. And I don't know if I've experienced post-traumatic growth or even if it's something that you can choose to experience. I don't even know if I've been traumatized by what we went through or if that's too strong of a word. But I have, in the wake of being a caretaker for this person for a little while, felt those moments of profound gratitude to be alive. Those moments when suddenly you're not on autopilot for a second and you really feel what a miracle it is to have breath in your lungs. And there were a few instances when I experienced that feeling when I was reading this book. Moments when I felt like Gilbert really was in touch with something, particularly when she was writing about Rayya's final days. And I think that those little moments are what we live for. When the curtain is lifted and suddenly we see reality for what it really is, a place abundant with wonder and enchantment. And any artist who can help that audience experience that magic, even if it's just for a few seconds, is somebody who has created valuable and worthwhile art. And they have my gratitude. So even though I've been very critical of this book, Elizabeth Gilbert wrote something that I can stand here and talk about for hours. So there must have been something hearty in there, even if it wasn't my personal taste. I'll put a link to the book in the description if you feel like it might have something in there for you. And if my voice is still in your ears and you made it all the way here, then I guess I have something for you too. So you should subscribe to my channel. My name is Siobhan Breyer Aguilar. I'm a professional writer and editor, and I do deep dives like this one about books, articles, other forms of media as well. I put a lot of time into these, so your support means a lot to me. You can support the channel or join our book club on Patreon at the link in the description. Oh my God. I've been recording for so long. I'm so tired. I'm gonna go to bed. Thank you. Habla mucho. Habla mucho.